chances are you have used one of our solutions but didn't even know that you are interfacing with our technologies. If you've booked a flight, traded something on TradeMe, our APIs kick in and protect you and trigger things like multi-factor authentication, protecting you and your accounts from bad actors who are constantly trying to crack and get into your accounts.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain, and today very pleased to have Justin Soong, the founder and technical director at Auth-Signal, joining us on the New Zealand Tech Podcast. How are you, Justin?
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here. Third time now on the New Zealand Tech Podcast.
Yeah, look, always good to catch up, and yeah, great to have a bit of a coffee chat today, and then we're going to sort of pack into this episode the sort of usual tech news of the week type topics. Looking forward to hearing some of your opinions there, and then to sort of really hear some of your insights, I guess, when we talk about sort of identity and authentication and so on, the world in which you operate on. Maybe you can just fill listeners in on what it is you do at Auth-Signal for those that aren't familiar.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Paul. So at Auth-Signal, we are a cybersecurity company, and we protect you and your accounts. And chances are you have used one of our solutions but didn't even know that you are interfacing with our technologies. So if you've booked a flight, if you've traded something on TradeMe, our APIs, for example, kick in and protect you and trigger things like multi-factor authentication, protecting you and your accounts from the big bad world of cyber bad actors who are constantly trying to crack and get into your accounts.
Yeah. In fact, it's interesting because I was chatting to one of the team at Xero on the cybersecurity side at a cyber conference I was emceeing, I think last year. And we started chatting around authentication, and it didn't take too long before we started chatting around Auth-Signal, and we got on to Air New Zealand using your technology. And I think that the comment that came there from one of their senior tech folks was, that was Air New Zealand was the first place that I set up and started using Passkeys, and that's Auth-Signal's technology at play. So and I think that's actually quite common around New Zealand, is if someone's had a first experience on Passkeys, which is, I hope is probably all or the very large majority of those listening, has quite possibly been with Air New Zealand or another platform that uses your technology.
Yeah, and this is a public service announcement to anyone who doesn't know what a passkey is. Chances are you are on a Google, Microsoft account, you have accounts with, you've just mentioned Air New Zealand. Turn it on, it's going to protect you a heck of a lot more than your password can. It's that layer of defense that the bad actors are struggling to try and crack. And one of the big qualities of a passkey is its phishing resistance. Without going into too much detail, what that means is a bad actor can't ask for your passkey and then go to a service provider and go, hey, look, open the door for me. There are some really great smarts that stop them from doing that. And if you look at a password or a PIN or, dare I say it, the SMS one-time password codes that you get, all these types of technologies are phishable. I can ask you and you can tell it to me, and then I can pass it on.
That's right.
And passkeys are so great at mitigating that phishing risk that you find in other types of authentication.
Yeah, and there was a very interesting example in the last few weeks. I can't remember whether we've discussed it on the show already, which was Troy Hunt getting phished, and he runs the Have I Been Pwned website that tells you about all of these organizations and their databases that have been hit and compromised, and so here's a guy that lives and breathes this sort of stuff, and then he succumbed to a phishing attack, put in his username, his password, and this is all out there. He's published a blog post about it. It's very transparent. And then he went and got his multi-factor code and put that in, And, the moment he had done that, this particular email database that he had was, compromised and downloaded by the bad actor. And he, moments later, he realized what had happened, quite possibly because of, after he'd entered those, it didn't, it didn't respond in the appropriate manner. And so, it is, people aren't infallible, even those that live and breathe these things. So, one of his comments was, if he'd had, Passkeys enabled on that account, then look, this wouldn't have happened. So yeah, really good. Well, we'll come back and delve a bit more into that later on in the show. Of course, a big thank you to our show partners, 1NZ, 2 Degrees, Spark HP, and Gorilla Technology. Really appreciative of their support of the show over the years and of the broader sort of technology and innovation ecosystems that they really get in behind in New Zealand. First up on the sort of local news front, finalists for New Zealand High Tech Awards have been announced. Look, it's always really exciting actually sort of following what goes on with the High Tech Awards because, in some cases we're hearing about those companies that have been working away for years and years and years and they've maybe, really hit a real sort of, pinnacle sort of point. And others there, the emerging companies, the startups that are just starting to come through. It might be the first time we've ever heard of them, but they're doing, in every case, they're doing some pretty amazing work behind the scenes. So lots of companies to mention there: Crimson Education, Cami, Link Engine Management, Scios Aerospace, Take Communications. They're all up for the PwC High Tech Company of the Year award, and then there's a big list of others across the other areas, and I'm sure if you go through that list, and I won't run through them now, but you can see all of them listed on the website. That there'll be a bunch there that you probably have come across at some point along the way. And there'll be other ones you'll be wondering, well, who are these folks and why are they up for an award? So we'll certainly be working, whether it's sort of in the sort of space between now and the High Tech Awards, which I think off the top of my head probably May time frame in Wellington. So yeah, that's definitely something we'll look forward to, and sharing some of those details, and we'll probably chat with some of the winners as well. Just checking the dates there. The gala dinner, 23rd of May 2025. So if you haven't got your tickets and so on, it's kind of starting to be that time to start thinking about getting flights booked if you're not Wellington based, as it's in Wellington this year, and getting a ticket, because it's always a really amazing event, I guess, from a perspective of just catching up with people from the sector around the country and getting a taste of what's really happening.
I hope they still do the sit down dinners. I've been to one. Yeah, it's a great night out, and we don't celebrate enough here in New Zealand. We beaver away for 12 months in the year, and to have the tech ecosystem come together to celebrate, it's great.
Yeah. So we'll come back and delve more into that. Now, this is one thing, I guess, with having show partners that are in the tech and the telecommunications sector. A lot of times they're in the media for the good things that they're doing, but they also don't get it right all the time. So I guess I like to be quite transparent and to call companies out if they're a partner or not of the show, or if there's something that hasn't gone right. I don't think we should sort of hide those things. So we got the news through that 2 Degrees have been fined $325,000 for what's described as making misleading claims to customers. This comes from the Commerce Commission, so we're actually quite used to these stories coming through particularly in the telecommunications sector, because these companies, if we look at 2 Degrees, 1NZ, Spark, they're really big companies, and everyone in New Zealand, every adult is likely to be using, one of those companies or one of their brands, or if they're using another mobile provider, it's going to be off one of their networks. So this one, it's taken a while to kind of get through the process, but 2 Degrees advertised roaming that they listed as free or at no extra cost. But what they got pulled up on was that customers were actually charged after 90 days of use, and that wasn't in the headline. So if you were traveling, I mean, it'd probably a reasonably unusual case to be, in Australia for 90 days on the trot, or even 90 days, in a given year, as another scenario. And I think it's a total of 90 days of use, but they were pinged for that. What are your thoughts on this, Justin? Like, how do you get these things, perfect and appropriate? Because generally these things are covered off in their fine print somewhere. But how big should your headline be around these sorts of capabilities? Because I guess they used it as a bit of a headline thing to go, hey, we're doing something different. And if we look at each telco, everyone tends to pick, I'm going to focus on this thing, I'll focus on that. And they pick their own areas to differentiate a little bit.
Yeah, I think this problem with misleading statements seemed to be a recurring theme in telco for the last 20 years. I think everyone's had a turn at breaching some form of misleading marketing. So yeah. I think it's a very difficult problem because telco products are very complicated. I don't even check my bill these days because I'm traveling quite a bit and it'll take too much of my time to check. But I think, in this day and age, consumers really keen for a fair go, and we don't even have fair go anymore to look after consumers. So yes. Consumer rights, I think, good on the regulatory body to act. I think we need to set a high bar in New Zealand, not let those standards slip. So, good thing that there's some transparency and hopefully, you can learn from that mistake and move on. Yeah.
Yeah. And I do see that, this is an area where, 2 Degrees have led on this idea of not charging roaming to, at least the business customers. Maybe it's postpaid plans that you're covered with that level of free roaming. But I see it's not exclusively them now who are offering, some sort of capability or type of offering. So, it's obviously sort of caught the attention, and maybe it is one of those scenarios where others have lost a bit of market, have lost some customers, because actually if your business is one where, you're traveling quite often, this is an area where they've delivered something that makes a difference to certain customers.
Yeah, it's a compelling proposition, I think, as a headline. So I'm sure there are many customers that would have switched or because of that campaign. So I think lesson is go talk to your internal teams before pushing something out.
Yeah, well, they've all got they've got significant marketing capability and legal teams and so on, right? So I don't think any of these companies are thinking that they're going to get hit. But when you get a $325,000 fine, it certainly will have something of an impact internally. Now, moving on, acquisitions. There's always tend to be different acquisitions going on in the tech space. Sometimes with startups, sometimes more well established firms. And a couple that have taken place recently that we haven't mentioned before. Serato. Now, this is not a complete acquisition, but this was, I guess, in the news going back in the direction of a couple of years that Serato were likely to be acquired, and it was the Overseas Investment Office and I think the Commerce Commission that can be part of the play. And interestingly, there was pushback from a anti-competitive sort of stance, I think, from the Commerce Commission last time round, in that they declined this acquisition from Alpha Theta, and it was going to be north of 100 million New Zealand dollars, so it was a pretty big deal at the time. Now, Young Lee, I think he's the CEO. He's been on the podcast in the past. He's still the chief executive there, and I guess under under his watch now, this next deal has gone through, and so what they've done is they've sold a majority stake to a Canadian firm and technology company, Tiny, and they've taken a 66% stake. And this particular deal now puts a valuation on Serato of 175 million. So, just shows how impressive Serato is, and what a valuable business that is, that's been that's been built. And I guess this is technology that started out as some pretty humble software for dealing with sort of time stretching of audio. I remember being sent access to some very early software back when I had a little startup in the electronic music world a long time ago. But now the world's top DJs using their technology every time you see them on stage with a Pioneer sort of DJ kit and varying other equipment. So quite a big success story, and quite pleasing. I would say that actually there's a part of the business that at this point anyway hasn't been sold.
Yeah, and we haven't given them enough airtime here in New Zealand. They are absolutely, hands down, one of the best New Zealand exports and success stories, right? And how often do you hear the Serato name, unless you're into DJing or know a few DJs? Absolutely shouting from rooftops. An amazing success story. It needs to be up there, and I'm glad that they're getting the funding or the ownership that's required to continue their success. And so good. It's just down the road here in Auckland.
Yeah.
Employing amazing talent, software engineers, game-changing, world-changing. I can't sing enough praises for a company like Serato blazing a trail for all of us.
Yeah, and look, they've been at it for a really long time. So yeah, it's always encouraging to see those sort of exit type opportunities for founders and investors along the way. The other one, and this is a few weeks ago now, but we didn't mention it, was Quantifi Photonics, who I guess they and if you're not familiar with the term photonics, what I'm familiar with was it really relates to, in a lot of cases, sort of fiber optic type tech. The AI breakdown I see that I got was that photonics is the branch of technology concerned with the properties and transmission of photons. But what they do is develop and manufacture the test solutions for that sector. And yeah, some pretty impressive and interesting technology, and a number of entities that were invested in them. One of them being Punakaiki Fund, and we had Lance Wiggs who heads that up on the podcast a while back, and some will know. I've found Punakaiki Fund to be an interesting way to be able to, I guess, put a little bit into our startup sector in New Zealand. So when I saw that had been sold, of course, I'm like, oh, this is good for me as a very small time investor. And yeah, I think I guess I would encourage listeners to look at, well, how can you be involved in supporting our tech sector and startups? And I guess everyone or most people have some form of investment, whether it's a KiwiSaver or what have you. And so yeah, it excites me to see some of these exits happening. At other times, I sort of feel like, I wish they hadn't been sold just yet. I'm sure they've got good opportunities ahead. But this is all part of building our local ecosystem out. And so often the funds that come when one of these acquisitions happens end up flowing back into the tech sector with the next startup. And of course, we build up more and more expertise, and we get better and better at how to take these companies out to the world, right?
Yeah, and that's what happened in Silicon Valley over decades to get to where they are now. Obviously, very, very much the model for venture, but that's off, years and years of Xerox and HP and these sorts of companies that you don't really talk about too much anymore, but they we're involved in a lot of the success stories, and you can trace lineages of founders back to other founders that go back to roots from, the old school Silicon Valley firms. So who knows, in the next 10, 20 years, I hope that, we can trace lineages back to Xero, TradeMe, and you're already starting to see those employees go out, build businesses. So yeah, it's a compounding effect. Startups are so crucial for New Zealand, and we need to get more people investing in it, and Punakaiki is one channel to do that.
Yep, and that's part of your background, right? Working
Yeah.
in the startup world that that gave you valuable experience,
That's right.
prior to launching Auth Signal.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. So on to sort of the international front. Microsoft have turned 50. That makes me feel a little bit old because they've been around as long as I can remember. Technology companies. The old Microsoft Basic used to be, pretty common on some of those early computers and so on, and have been a fascinating company to watch with their ups and downs, and I guess personally I spent a bit of time working inside Microsoft on a kind of contracted basis in my earlier years, and of course their technology within certainly New Zealand businesses, they've had a big part to play over the years.
So what was your first memory was Basic, was it?
I mean, I remember before I came across MS-DOS, and Windows, which were on the IBM and in those early days the clone PCs. I definitely interacted with and programmed in the Basic language, of which Microsoft would have been one of the they were one of the key players in that world in those early days. I can't remember specifically whether I did any programming on a Microsoft Basic or whether it was on somebody else's Basic, but that was certainly, I guess, key to them, with Altair Basic being their first sort of real major
now
product.
Just giving away your age without giving it away completely. Yeah, mine was MS-DOS, I think 3.1 or Windows 3.1 was the operating system that I have the earliest recollection. So then you can go work out and reverse engineer my age there. And I just remember, 10 or 20 floppy disks to install the operating system, and then you have to put them in one by one to get your OS installed, and you'd have to reformat every year just to get it back to how it was.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, the Microsoft were based just the building across from the one we're in now, back in it's over 30 years ago now, when I was at their local kind of New Auckland office. It was in Simon Street here in Auckland. And I remember going back to my office, the company that I was working for, but then contracted through to Microsoft, with a stack of those, I think, 3.5-inch floppy disks to install what was the sort of what eventually has become Windows 11 through its many iterations, Windows NT 3.1 beta. And it was a big stack of those 3.5-inch disks
and user manuals.
I think we had, I guess it would have been PDFs back then, but I remember studying for a Microsoft exam as a youngster. Maybe I was around 19 or 20, and they had these Microsoft exams that had just launched, and a couple of the founding New Zealand staff at Microsoft were doing these Microsoft exams for what was Windows NT then, and so somehow it got mentioned, and I was like, okay, I'll do that too. I remember they had this spreadsheet of all of the Microsoft certified professionals in the world, and because I was internal, you could actually open up I guess it was an Excel spreadsheet, and you could see everyone listed, and I was number 4,044 on the list. So they were gaining traction quite quickly. But of course, these days there's probably tens of millions of people that have done those exams. Not something I do these days. But they still play an important role within the tech sector, right?
Worth their weight in gold back in the day, right? If you're a Microsoft certified professional, I think MCP, you were a very desired hire.
And I think these things have got value today. So there's a lot we could kind of delve into. We would, in some ways we could do 10 episodes on Microsoft and still have, hundreds of topics that we hadn't touched. So I'm sure there will be people out there doing some, being 50 years of Microsoft. There'll be some pretty interesting content out there to look at for those that are curious. And I think that, like any business, they've had their ups and downs, but lots of lessons. And I think if you look at their current success, it speaks to a company that has innovated many times and continues to do so. But at times it looked like they'd really lost their way. And lots of stories, lots of factors.
And now we have a data center just down the road from here, right?
Yeah. Well, they've led the way on that front into New Zealand. Although interesting that there's a bit of a flip side to that, and we've been following that some of the data centers that they look like they were going to launch and open, have not proceeded. So ones where they've announced, ones where they've been putting in investment, and I think that's a sign of either the economy or of the fact that maybe some of their perspectives on AI haven't actually maybe needed to move as fast as what they thought. You could probably delve in further on that, but it is the realities, right? Is there is a huge amount of, I guess, speculation that innovative companies have to go through, and you have to make your judgment calls around where you're going to go, and sometimes you have to change tack pretty quickly. And the fact that they're still here 50 years on, I think gives some indications that they've often managed to get that right, but they've certainly not always got it right. In the early days on this show, there were, I guess, one of our hosts was a Microsoft employee, and we'd speak a fair bit about the Windows Phone ecosystem, which, although it was pretty cool, it didn't manage to catch on. Right?
Windows CE, wasn't it?
That was, I think that was sort of the underlying technology, and it had its various iterations.
Well, I hope they throw a big party and you're invited on the list.
All right, so moving on. Trump's tariffs was, huge news in the last week, and these things seem to be kicking off, pretty quickly. A lot of coverage around the world, but in sort of US tech media, they're really talking about the cost of some tech and some gadgets, potentially going up quite substantially, and what impact this might have in terms of sales. So, for those that are maybe invested in tech stocks, the likes of Apple and Samsung and others, those companies are quite likely to be hit in one way or another, whether it's a drop off in demand or a drop off in profitability. But there's certainly going to be an impact. I think here in New Zealand, for us as consumers, maybe not so much. So this is an interesting, perspective. It used to be that, you want the best price on a gadget. You might get it when you're on your travels, and maybe in the US because it's such a big market. But if anything that's come via the US carries a large tariff, then you might fly to the US to pay 50% more or 10 or 20% more, or whatever it lands up being on certain tech, rather than being, the place to get that new piece of tech.
Yeah, that's right. The cowboy hats that I've been wanting to buy will be going up. I think consumers in New Zealand probably not directly affected, but we all work for an exporter for some shape or form. If not, we're servicing an exporter. So, I don't generally tariffs are not good, and where things will probably have changed, in the next 24-hour news cycle. So things are moving so quickly, and everyone's trying to react, form an opinion about it. Markets still generally viewing this as not a good thing, and trying to reconcile that. So all eyes on the news, really, to see what announcement's going to come out of the US.
That's right, and look, on that basis, if you want to get the New Zealand Tech Podcast fresh, make sure you are following or subscribed through whether it's your favorite podcast app like Pocket Casts that I use, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. That's the way you get it the quickest. So you'll get it fairly quickly after we've launched, within hours, so same day, goes up on the website, usually the next day. And in a lot of cases, not this particular episode, but a lot of cases, there's also the live stream, which you can catch as we do it. So make sure if you want to get access to the live stream, you certainly follow me on LinkedIn or on X, and we're also on Facebook and YouTube as well. So
everywhere.
a few ways to sort of get access depending on how fresh you want it. Then the live stream is the very freshest, and for the audio podcast, really on any platform. On to other topics. It's certainly, as you say, it's going to be a pretty fast evolving topic, I imagine. And there'll be new news coming out pretty swiftly as we see what the impacts are in different areas. And sometimes some of these tariffs we've heard about get paused or pulled quite quickly. So certainly some interesting aspects. I think one of the things that stood out to me, I heard a few people say, hey, these are all justified. Look, Trump highlighted what all these countries were charging tariffs to the US, and Trump's only charging sort of half of the tariff. But as soon as we heard about, New Zealand's getting a 10% tariff, but New Zealand are charging a 20% tariff to the US, and I thought that's a bit of a load of rubbish, because the tariffs, and my understanding of it, you may know a little bit more, Justin, but tend to be sort of specific in particular areas. Like, if we're importing, if we were importing, I'll make something silly up, lamb, because why would New Zealand ever import lamb? But it might be to protect our local industry, that there would be a tariff for importing, say, lamb from another country, and that'd be a particular level. But we don't tend to have a flat sort of blanket 20% tariff for the US. So there's these sort of political things that come in, and they certainly encourage or create some confusion, I guess. So just want to be aware of there. But getting the full story on these things usually takes a lot more time and space than we get in a typical kind of news headline or even a TV story at times. And certainly we're not going to kind of dive into the depths of that here. But another topic that I saw, which was quite interesting, is that Amazon wants you to be using them so they're doing this testing of a new option where they can go out and buy stuff for you from a source outside of Amazon. So this is kind of agentic, agent-based AI. So a feature where you want something, it actually isn't available necessarily directly within Amazon's own ecosystem, but then they can pull it in from wherever, slide it into your Amazon app or Amazon website with a buy for me option, which means Amazon aren't selling it to you directly, but they'll go out and get it and pass through all of your details. And I guess in that type of scenario, there's sort of a range of possibilities how that might play out, whether they put a markup in there, whether exactly how that fits together, I think will be interesting to watch. But the fact that they're testing these things, I find quite fascinating. Apparently, they're doing it with a small subset of users in the US at this stage on iPhone and Android devices. So, just I guess a little bit of a taste of future possibilities, even if it's not something that we're going to get immediate access to in New Zealand.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about agentic workflows, bots effectively buying stuff on behalf of you, is a few things. One, the retailers now need to let these bots through. I think previously bots were considered a bad thing. They were there to do more harm than good, or try and exploit your e-commerce platform, or try and scrape Taylor Swift tickets. But now you could have an agent queuing up in line for you for your Taylor Swift tickets. And how do you reconcile that? What's a good bot? What's a bad bot acting on behalf of you? So I think there's a lot of emerging problems that are really ripe for some really good thinking. And it's really challenging the previous notions of, like I just mentioned, just what's
really,
a good bot,
really
what's a bad bot.
Yeah. Now, sort of leaning into sort of more security types of topics, which is very much your day-to-day world. What's happened in the US with the journalist who was invited to a Signal group where this chat was going on, between the sort of highest officials in the US around what were at that stage confidential, military plans against Yemen's Houthi militants. This was just a really bizarre one to read about, because you kind of you expect government officials to be operating in a particular manner, and having, I guess, using a public app like Signal, where people can just get invited, via name and the contacts, or a mobile number, and you don't really know how secure these consumer platforms are.
Yeah.
Just seem absolutely bizarre. I think it's fair to say. What was your take when you saw this, Justin?
Yeah, there's a few things. One was the similar surprise to you that they use Signal.
Yeah.
I think Signal is a great tool for end users like ourselves. But when you're dealing with classified military-grade information, I would have thought that there was dedicated platforms and secure channels for you to communicate. But I think this just shows you that it's a big problem in your world and our world of shadow IT.
Yeah.
Is you may have all the apps and all the secure channels for your employees, but how are you enforcing, looking after the shadow IT? And, I think there's some questions around controls, whether Signal was an approved application on these mobile phones. Second thing that stood out was these guys are just day-to-day people using emojis like we do.
Yeah.
Fist pumps and rockets emojis. And so I thought that was quite humanizing.
Yeah.
And then lastly is the puzzling thing. It's like, that's a pretty big blunder to invite someone into your group chat. I think that was the first thing you check when you start a WhatsApp group, is make sure you add the right person, right? So, and to have that, I guess, now I'm throwing everyone into headspin. Maybe check who's in your group chat just after this podcast. It might not be the person that you first thought it might be, and your address contacts are probably Paul B may not be the right Paul that you're adding to your group. So I think there's some learnings there. So the takeaways, for me is, look, it's all back down to human error. That is still the number one risk when it comes to cybersecurity, and it's not an easy one to fix, right?
It's not. And look, I keep seeing a range of scenarios where you just wonder how well was policy and guidance around these sort of types of topics. Like you talk about shadow IT, people using, their own, whether it's consumer-based tools or things that they've just gone and acquired without the organisation being involved, versus doing things properly. And so you wonder, why did Hillary Clinton, have the issues she had with things, government stuff on her own, through her own email server. I think Trump got caught up in somewhat similar things at some stage. Here we have people from his administration. So we've had all these lessons before, and there's that, were they given the guidance? Did they understand what the consequences were? Are there consequences for folks that do this sort of stuff and blatantly use a tool that, largely you would think that it would be a firing offence in that type of environment to be using this type of tool. Now, yes, it got downplayed as these things, sometimes are, but a really, really poor action. And you wonder about just if you were to delve in there, how well did they really understand? Because one of the things that I see within organisations is sometimes it's the more senior somebody gets.
I was just about to say.
Then the less interested they are, because they're like, no, I know all of that stuff. You don't necessarily need to, you don't necessarily need to tell me, or the whole team needs to go through and have that onboarding and have that
Correct.
training.
And I'm
But
exempt
then you've
from
got
it.
you've got some some senior folks that are like, hey, that but that's not us. Is it that? There's a whole range of scenarios, and then looking at the devices, like, okay, for this to happen, this is probably happening on personal devices, because you probably wouldn't imagine that the White House is giving out devices that have necessarily got consumer apps like Signal as the standard thing. So like there's so much to unpack there, isn't there?
Yeah, and you make a good point, and I think we don't have to go too far to see those instances of executives asking for exemptions for their own personal devices or work phones to have different things turned off and to have PIN codes turned off, because and very topical, something that we were very passionate about, because security generally is painful.
Yeah.
And the CEO, who is super busy, may be thrown into different types of loops when he wants to use his app or phone, and he starts getting super frustrated. So the first thing he goes to his head of cybersecurity or chief information officer is, turn these controls off for me, and I think where cyber teams and IT teams need to really, really be draw a line in the sand in is, no matter who you are in an organization, these controls should apply to everyone, and there's no exemptions, no matter whether you have a C in front of your title.
Yeah, and I think that can be a challenge. It can be pretty hard to to push back at times, because often leaders are they've got into these positions because they're very powerful communicators and negotiators, and can be quite strong-willed. So not everyone is necessarily geared up with what it takes to to go through one of those types of discussions or debates, and is able to push back. And so it's something that all of us that are involved in this world probably deal with from time to time, and from one side or another, and we do need to think about how we get the best outcomes, and for those that are in leadership positions, have some empathy for those that are on the other side.
And that's why I was so happy that you took out your YubiKey just before the podcast to authenticate yourself. You're leading by example, and that's amazing.
Oh, that's good. These are just sort of the everyday things, right? And look, I mean, I've had discussions internally on things and been challenged on, hey, Paul, no, you can't access XYZ from a personal device. Sometimes we'll get sent in these consumer devices for the podcast to review, and I'm like, oh, it's much easier if I can use that and do company work on it. And I had I got pulled up by one of our senior team members and said, no, we're not making an exception for you, and here's why. And actually that I just needed that pushback, and didn't take long to think about it. Yep, fair enough. Because if I'm getting special treatment, it needs to be a really, really, really good case. And that's the more I thought about it, I thought, no, that's that's not a special enough case. And I guess I'm used to sort of pushing others to sort of step up. So we've got to follow those things. And then so also on the security front is this Australian super fund, the cyber attacks there. Maybe you can walk us through this, because this is pretty close to home, but it also is in the sort of realm of what you do with all Signal. So I imagine you've been paying quite a lot of attention to this case.
No, we're following this quite closely. So cyber actors, and more importantly, potentially nation-state actors, have been targeting Australia and New Zealand, and it's a well-known fact. And the first thing that they are trying to do is not only extract funds out of our bank accounts or our insurance platforms or fund accounts. They are trying to embarrass our governments, and they have succeeded in a few ways over the last few years, including targeting politicians as one example, right? So, yeah, it is not a surprise, unfortunately, that the inevitable headline is coming up around the targeting of financial services. It's a well-known fact that this is going on, and I guess it's what is that this article and this event that happened on Friday, not going into specific details, but the threat is real to consumers. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars that have been per customer in this instance that have been able to be drained out of account, and to potentially the most vulnerable of the citizens and consumers, which is in the case of super funds or superannuation funds, it's the ones who are just about to retire, right? So the ones who are going to cash out their nest egg for the next 10 years or whatnot. So what we're big on is in 2025, you need to have an MFA first strategy in your organization, and we can help with that.
Without multi-factor authentication, you are really leaving the door wide open.
Wide open. And you talked about Troy Hunt earlier and the website, Have I Been Pawned? There's a high chance if you go to the website right now, key in your email address, a user account that you have used in the past, that username and password is highly probable being breached. So whether it's password 123 or password with your date of birth, which is one of the more common password combinations, assume that that's breached. Assume that that's public. And when you start taking that perspective, you realize the controls that some service providers have in place may not be adequate for 2025. Now you couple that to deep fakes, you couple that to the fact that I can clone your voice. This is where digital trust and safety online become a big minefield for the most vulnerable, and for people we like to think that savvy IT users, right? So things are moving very, very quickly. This headline that we've seen in the news around super funds is unfortunate. We really hope, I think, in this part of the world, we have more concrete government regulation and teeth when it comes to large organizations who deal with our money, especially stepping up to the plate and putting these controls in. And one thing that we touched on at the start of the podcast is phishing resistant authentication. And the only one that's available, and I mentioned YubiKeys as well, is a passkey. And we're going to see more regulation in Asia coming out of this year. One of the reserve banks in Asia, won't name the country, but you'll find out very soon. They're considering issuing a YubiKey to every single citizen. It's how serious cybersecurity and affecting citizens has gotten to take that proactive action from this government, right? So I'd like to see a lot more of that. Unfortunately, if the status quo still stands, you'll see more headlines, and we hate that. We don't like that. It's the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. If you are listening and are a decision maker and are looking to prioritize initiatives within your organization, put multi-factor authentication or passkeys at the top of your list. It's only going to be good for your customers. And to be honest, what we're seeing is all the hesitancy around these sorts of technologies, around friction, and we can solve all of that. That's what we specialize in, making the customer experience really smooth. And what we're seeing is actually customers are now using these technologies like they, because they're so used to it, on their phones, and just breezing through it.
Yeah.
And they're going through making a purchase, booking their flights, transferring money, buying something off an auction without too much hassle. Plus they get a security uplift.
A real peace of mind, right, when you've got these things set. Right.
So, and then if you're a consumer if you're hearing this and you're going, yeah, this is not good enough, if my service provider is still using really archaic forms of authentication, do put pressure. Do go and ask them why, when I ring up, you're asking me for my date of birth as a security question. Because chances are, if I go to your Facebook account or Instagram account, I can figure out your date of birth. And if I've just heard, that the fact that you worked on Microsoft Basic, I can probably pin down to the exact year as well. So yeah, look, it's a minefield, and we're so passionate about getting everyone safe and secure, especially with new authentication technologies.
Yeah. Look, I was one of those who my first experience. Well, it's certainly my first sort of successful experience with Passkeys was Air New Zealand, which is your tech. But I also noticed with them, when calling up over the last little while, that they put you through a bit of a verification process when you call up for help over the phone. And I was kind of a little bit curious about that, because that's your technology as well, right? And I guess I'm looking at sort of recent scenarios, talking to different entities, banks, airlines, and others, and I did see someone sort of posting on, it was a bit of a hassle to get through into Air New Zealand and so on. But when I thought about sort of the alternatives, and actually it happens pretty quickly on the phone. So you call up, they say, hey, we're going to send you a message to confirm who you are and so on. That all kind of happens while you're effectively getting in the queue or in the queue anyway, and then there's no backwards and forwards with them asking who you are and verify with silly things like birth dates, which I'm pretty sure that it's a high percentage of the population whose birth dates have been in a data breach. So we go online and look up a particular person's birth date using appropriate sort of tools. You're going to find that in a data breach, if it's not already publicly just left out there on a social network as it is in other cases. So I was just quite pleased with that versus a bank example recently, and just the sort of hoops that they were trying to jump through of, can you name this and that particular bank, and wanting to name different transactions and different things that there was their way
naming
of
the
kind
transactions,
of working it out, and like that was a bit of backwards and forwards actually. That I actually probably feel more relaxed now that I'm used to it around the approach that Air New Zealand are taking, and I think we need to be able to gain that sort of confidence going forwards. And also, if you're taking an incoming call, there are challenges there, right? The person's saying, what's your birth date and this and that, and you're like, hold on, you called me, why do I have to give you that detail? And still there's a lot of organizations, I think probably most organizations, if they need to call you and they need to verify who it is, they don't have an approach that's particularly trustworthy or appropriate on that front.
Yeah, and kudos to the Air New Zealand team. They are not just blazing a trail in the customer experience. They take feedback on and they want to give you a great experience while keeping you safe and secure. So full kudos to the team there. And to those who are listening, again, if you're in a position where you're influencing customer experience, we've got a great leading light here to follow. And like, Paul just mentioned, if you're still asking your customers what they ate last night as a security question, which personally I think is a very intrusive question. I don't need to tell you whether I've eaten a burrito or gone to Domino's. Those are very private information that I like to keep, or KFC, hot and crispy boneless chicken, which coincidentally I had last night. Again, those are really things that you shouldn't need to intrude on your customer to verify who they are. So these are the things that we again dive very deep in. It's our bread and butter. We're seeing different types of use cases and problems around verification and identity. One entity here in New Zealand onboards many of their employees online, and for the most part, only meet your counterpart or your colleague at a party and figure out and go, oh, wow, didn't realize you're this high or this short or look like that, because for a lot of the times you're dealing with them with Zoom or through email alone, and we've trusted that. We've trusted that the person on the other side of the phone or the Zoom call is who they say they are and not a deep fake.
Yeah.
So again, it's lots of digital trust issues that are emerging. Oh, and Gen AI and deep fakes are probably one of the big issues to tackle in the next few months.
Yeah, well, when you can fake a voice and fake a video and so on, that really, changes the picture a fair bit. And we've certainly heard about, a range of issues in that space. Hey, great to catch up, Justin. If folks, I guess the sort of organisations you work with are those who tend to deal with a lot of consumers.
Yep.
So it could be an airline, a bank, a retailer, sort of, that's kind of your
That's our sweet spot.
You tend to sit. So if folks are interested in that sort of technology wherever they sit within the business, what's the best way of kind of finding out a little bit more about AuthSignal?
Yeah, great. So just hop on our website, authsignal.com. If you're in New Zealand, you're already interacting with a few of our customer experiences. Have a go. I mean, the first thing that you do, and I advise everyone, is to get a passkey onboarded in some of your favorite service providers there. It's going to save you time the next time you interact with the service provider, but it's also going to keep you very secure. So we've got a great team here in Auckland, so hit us up, and we're only a email away to help with your requirements.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, really, really nice to have you back on New Zealand Tech Podcast. It's always interesting to catch up, because you see and hear things that maybe the rest of us don't necessarily see, as well as obviously a lot of the things that are going on publicly as well. So really good. And of course, a big thank you to our show partners again, Gorilla Technology, HP Spark, 2 Degrees, and 1NZ. We really thank them for their support and everything that they do for the tech and innovation ecosystems within New Zealand. Well, that's us for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening in, and we'll look forward to catching you on the next episode. Apologies, we skipped an episode last week. I was at a funeral, and I'm traveling a bit this month, but we do have episodes coming through, so shouldn't be any other gaps coming up in the immediate future. So thanks everyone. We'll catch you again next week. Cheers.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.